Today's video is one that I simply had to make. For many years, I've been very morbidly interested in the whole Jack the Ripper story. Like so many people, you don't have to be a ripperologist to be super intrigued by this mystery that's lasted for 130 years. I mean, it is the classic true crime story. And over the years, there have been so many theories, so many suspects, so many different people out there throwing their 2 pence in. And it's just this epic mystery, which is obviously grounded in some of the most horrible, brutal murders the world has ever seen. And the tragedy of those 5 poor women who were slaughtered by him is at the very core of the story. But that mystery of who was Jack the Ripper, who committed these terrible crimes, is one that's evaded us for 130 years. People have thrown names out there, various different evidence has been put forward to back certain claims, and over the years certain suspects have maybe bumped up that list a little bit more than others, and we have more recently maybe been kind of finding a little bit more consensus over who people think is the most likely suspect. But in the last few days, certain people have come out claiming to have scientific evidence of the identity of Jack the Ripper. And as somebody who's been very interested in this case for a long time, I had to jump on here and take a real look at the evidence that's been put forward and whether we should be taking this seriously. So, over the years, one name has stepped a little bit further ahead of most of the other suspects that have always been listed as potential Jack the Rippers. And that man was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and barber who was living and working in the Whitechapel area at the time, that being 1888. And that man is the man that is now claimed to have been proved through DNA to be the murderer. So, here's what they're saying. An author and historian and self-proclaimed ripperologist named Russell Edwards, who also, by the way, runs his own guided Jack the Ripper tours in Whitechapel, has claimed to have definitively identified Jack the Ripper through DNA analysis, claiming that he's obtained a 100% match during DNA analysis to Aaron Kosminski, the Polish barber. The DNA used was obtained from a famous shawl that supposedly belonged to Catherine Eddowes, one of Jack the Ripper's 5 victims. I say supposedly because there's perhaps a little controversy about that point, so we'll come back to that in a second. Now, Edwards purchased this shawl himself back in 2007. And working with genealogists, he managed to track down a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski. Now, Kosminski never had any children, which made it slightly trickier, but he managed to track down a descendant of Kosminski's sister, who agreed to provide a sample using a swab from her mouth. And apparently, analysis has revealed both a match for the victim, Catherine Eddowes, and Kosminski. Now, obviously, this has led to a lot of interest, and descendants of Catherine Eddowes, the Eddowes family, have come forward and are pushing for an inquest into the killings, taking into account this new evidence. And there's a big push from Edwards and the families to basically open this new inquest and essentially close the Jack the Ripper case. And be like, yep, bam, it was Aaron Kosminski, he was the Ripper, case closed, which obviously would bring some closure to the families of the 5 women who were involved in this. Now, I wanted to make a video on this because on the surface of it, it looks very black and white. You've got a shawl that was found at the murder scene, which has traces of blood that has been matched to Catherine Eddowes, and also traces of what has been claimed to be semen. And that's where the DNA was found that was supposedly a match for Kosminski. So of course there's a lot of commentary around this on, case closed. The results from the DNA are black and white, they prove it conclusively, there you go. Let's shut the whole thing down, we never need to speak about Jack the Ripper ever again. But I'm not so sure we should be jumping to such a definitive conclusion. I mean, it's Jack the Ripper, there's always someone out there who is very keen to just claim, I know who he was, all of my evidence is better than everyone else's evidence. And of the known suspects, Kosminski has always been put forward by a lot of people who are very invested and have done a lot of research as being the main suspect from the list of suspects. Though personally I find the evidence against all of the suspects is, it's never been conclusive. There's a reason we're 130 years later and nobody's actually been able to pinpoint the exact guy and be like, oh, here you go, it was him and this is why. It's because there's not really been enough evidence to properly point the finger at anybody. So it's always been little bits of evidence here and there, and then a lot of, this is what I think happened. And obviously in cases where you're trying to identify a murderer, this is what I think happened doesn't really hold any water compared to cold, hard facts. But yes, this is potentially the closest we've come to actually identifying Jack the Ripper. But the whole reason I'm doing this is because, again, despite what the commentary around it is seeming to indicate, it is not conclusive. And there are several reasons that this DNA match does not conclusively identify Kosminski as being Jack the Ripper. Now, there are a few kind of small points arguing against being able to use this as conclusive evidence, and then one big smoking gun right in the middle. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, let's go over these smaller things. And the first one of those, which is very important, is DNA when it comes to solving crimes. Ever since it first started being used in forensic investigation, has often been used as a bam, there you go. That solves a crime, bam, we've got DNA evidence, perfect, that's all we need. And in some cases, sure, maybe that works. But in a lot of cases, that's not good enough. And the DNA evidence taken from this shawl, we have to remember, is 130 years old. So not only are we dealing with a tiny sample of 130-year-old DNA, it is also very clear that this shawl has been passed from person to person, from place to place, for the last 130 years. So not only do we have sample degradation, the degradation of the DNA that was present on this shawl over the last 130 years, because obviously they weren't testing it at the time, but it's also almost certainly been contaminated in that time. We also have to take into account the fact that Kosminski, a Polish immigrant, neatly fit that outsider model that some people were pushing. Especially at the time, we can't rule out the fact that straight up xenophobia and racism was definitely a part of certain calls for this is the guilty man. And even though it's been a long time, this is a case that's been so unsolved and so bandied about for so long, 130 years, that we can't rule out the fact that certain theories are unknowingly being influenced by that really early racism that was bandied about. And yes, there were witnesses at the time who saw Eddowes supposedly talking to a man who sounded foreign, but again, that's hardly enough evidence to point at Kosminski and go, hey, yeah, does he sound foreign too? Yeah, he must be the guy. So there's a little potential historic racism there at play as well, however subtle that might be. And there's also some doubt about whether the shawl that was used for DNA evidence is in fact a shawl. So get this thing has since been cut into multiple sections and multiple people have ended up with different parts of it. But originally, this thing was 8 feet long and 2 feet wide. Now, just picture that for a second. That's 2 foot bit taller than me and almost twice as wide as me. If that was a shawl, it would have completely swamped anyone who wore it. I mean, it's even been posed that that sounds more like a table runner than a shawl. So this thing was huge. And yes, you might say, well, hey, Catherine Eddowes was a prostitute, she was poor, she'd take anything she could get her hands on and use as clothing to wrap up on a cold night. And regardless of that, she was wearing it anyway. It had her blood and semen on it. So there you go. What more do you have to say? But that's what brings us to our big smoking gun. And that's the fact that there is no evidence pointing to the shawl being found at the murder scene at all. As far as we know, from witness testimony, from recordings and descriptions of the crime scene, even from the first person to arrive on the crime scene, no one ever mentions there being a shawl there. She wasn't wearing the shawl, it wasn't on the floor next to her, it wasn't tossed into some corner. As far as we know, it was not there. So how do we know this? Well, the first police officer on the scene was Police Officer Watkins of the City of London Police. And when he arrived on the scene and discovered the body, he had a few things that he needed to do. He first had to check and see if she was still alive, and if she was, try and help her stay alive and call for a doctor, and so, help her until a doctor could turn up. He then would have had to have contained the crime scene until his superiors and a doctor arrived. And whilst waiting, he would have also had to have kind of attempted to start the investigation, see if he could gather any fingerprints or note any evidence that he found. And they managed to actually contain the crime scene pretty quickly. The body was found in a place called Mitra Square, which was a very kind of enclosed square, essentially. So it wasn't a difficult crime scene to contain. And so any evidence that was present should have been easily found. And at the time, they also didn't want to act with haste just in case they'd missed anything. Because they were obviously trying to work out who this guy that was killing women across Whitechapel was. They wanted to put an end to this. And so they thoroughly investigated the area. The authorities stated that the body was not touched until the doctor arrived, and that a few possessions were found in the immediate area. 3 small black buttons, the kind used for women's boots, a small metal button, a common thimble, and a small mustard tin containing pawn tickets. Then the body was removed and stripped. An extensive list of all the possessions on Catherine Eddowes' person was made. And in that list of items, there are around 33 different things. Every single item of clothing she was wearing and every single thing she had on her was listed in that roughly, 33 to 35 things that she had. And of that extensive list, not a single one of them was this shawl. So it wasn't there. If this shawl had been present, it would have been a major piece of evidence. The fact that they went to so much trouble to list every single thing they found, including the buttons and the mustard tin and everything that was around the body in this square, why would they have forgotten to mention this huge shawl? And it was never mentioned by a single other police officer present at the scene. In no report is the shawl mentioned. So did somebody remove the shawl from the scene? It's possible. There was a police officer who was involved in, containing the scene and helping with crowd control, whose family has they call it a family tradition of claiming that it was him who removed the shawl from the crime scene and then passed it down through generations of his family. But again, why would he do this? There's no evidence to claim that he was the first officer on the scene. That was Watkins. So if he had removed the shawl, he would have had to have done it when there were many other officers there seeing him do it. And again, by that point, someone would have noticed that there was a shawl there and made note of that, and then made note that it was missing. And then remember, this thing was huge. If he had taken it, his shift didn't end until 6 a.m, and this was in the early hours of the morning. So he would have had to carry that thing around on his shift for another few hours. We just drape it around his shoulders like a cape. It doesn't add up. So even if this DNA test is accurate, and we haven't got to see the actual results of it yet due to, data protection, we can never conclusively say that that shawl was there, and there is far more evidence pointing to the fact that it was not at the crime scene. In fact, some academics don't believe it even belonged to Catherine Eddowes. Now, to me, this is a huge red flag. Where did this shawl come from? Just seems to have been kind of delivered out of thin air. Are we even sure it dates back to the 1880s? Are we even sure it's a shawl, let alone that it was on Catherine Eddowes' body at the scene of the crime? So when did it even show up? Well, it was in 1988 when it was discovered that a couple in Essex were claiming to own Catherine Eddowes' shawl. And they didn't in fact have the whole shawl, but they had 2 pieces that had been cut off and framed together. And they were cut off by the previous owner of the shawl, a man named David Melville Hayes, who was the great-great-nephew of Amos Simpson, the man whose family claimed that it was he who took the shawl from the scene of the crime. And for some reason, he chopped off 2 pieces of it and traded them to a random couple from Essex. David Hayes then took that remaining large portion of the shawl that he had to Sotheby's in London to try and get it dated. Sotheby's concluded that it dated back to the early 1900s, so obviously about 12 years after Jack the Ripper was active and 12 years after Catherine Eddowes was murdered. And it was that main piece of the shawl that was put up for auction in 2007, and it's that Russell Edwards bought and took for DNA testing. And that's how we end up where we are today, with the news that this DNA is a 100% match for Aaron Kosminski. And yes, no one has yet been able to see the full results of this test, so we're kind of going on what they're claiming at the moment. We'll wait to see if a new inquest is opened and this evidence can actually be taken and used, and we'll see what the results of that are. So the shawl, as far as we know, was never at the crime scene. What does any of that matter if we have an exact match for Catherine Eddowes' blood and a match for Aaron Kosminski's DNA in the semen sample on this shawl, which, I'll grant you, looks incredibly suspicious. As long as we have no evidence that this shawl was present at the crime scene, the blood and the semen on it cannot be linked to the murder. If it had categorically been found around her shoulders when she was found lying dead in that square, then sure, that's your evidence right there. We'll take that to the bank. But as long as it wasn't, and as long as we don't have any other categorical evidence, it still can't 100% prove that Kosminski was our Ripper. Because remember, Eddowes was a prostitute. It's likely that many items of clothing that she owned probably had trace amounts of semen on them from men that she'd been with. Kosminski and Eddowes could have hooked up a few nights previously or at any other point, and that same evidence could have been left there on that shawl. Although obviously, if it was a table runner, which it certainly sounds like, then maybe they got a little too busy working on the table that table runner was on, and that's how our samples ended up where they ended up. So there we go. What do you think? I'm personally of the opinion that as long as we can't link that shawl directly to that crime scene, then those samples could have appeared at any time, not necessarily even at the same time as each other. So 100% identifying who each sample belonged to still doesn't get us all the way there. Yes, I'll admit this is probably the closest we've come, and yes, Kosminski is still up there in the list of candidates who could be Jack the Ripper, but it still doesn't completely answer that question, and I'm not sure at this point anything will. And with Jack the Ripper, there's always been a tendency for people to bend the evidence, to bend the truth, because people are so keen to know or work out who this guy was, or be the person to work out who this guy was. And you've got the people who are desperate to work out who he was and finally solve the mystery, to be the guy who solved the mystery. Then you've got the people who are a bit like me, who are like, it's been so long, we're never going to really know. There's nothing we have anymore that will conclusively tell us the answer. And after 130 years, with those two things butting up against each other, with all of the evidence or lack of evidence that we've discussed, I just don't think we'll ever conclusively know. And as long as that is the case, Aaron Kosminski will still just be our best bet, but never completely our Jack the Ripper. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments whether you think I'm completely barking up the wrong tree, because, you know, I'm not a ripperologist. I've not studied this as much as a lot of other people. I mean, maybe that's good. Maybe I'm coming into this with a slightly more, you know, an objective outsider's perspective, but maybe not. Who knows? So let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, do all the usual stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.